Welcome back. Another episode, Chadrick's Tech. In this episode, we want to revisit a video or a series of videos that was published on the channel. And the reason we're doing that is I believe that there was some resurgence of popularity. The same topics have come up with other content creators. I know Jay's Two Cents put out one of these types of videos, as well as some other content creators. Now, I am not casting shade out toward Jay and the other people that have published this information. Those videos were very good. I just believe that if I can be so bold, I believe I've researched and tested my data a little bit more completely, and I think you would benefit in terms of seeing the information that I'm presenting here. And I hypothesized that perhaps I am a younger content creator compared to Jay and other bigger channels out there in the YouTube space. But the other thing is, I think that I separated the videos up into three different chunks. And I did that just to make the sections a little bit more appreciable. Of the first one, letting you know what I thought was interesting and what I was going to test, and some hypotheses of what I thought was going to happen. And then the second was the initial test results from a set of hardware. And then the third was thinking that I needed to really beef up the hardware, so I added a 5090 to the mix and pushed a 5090 through the PCI bus to see if I'd find a difference or a change in my data. With those three videos, I thought that I had good chunks of data that would hopefully keep the audience engaged. But I think just because I'm a newer content creator, I'm not pushed out there as readily in the algorithm as some of the other more popular channels, the older channels out on the internet. And I understand I'm willing to bide my time here, pay my respective dues, for an example, but I'm here to stay, and we're going to keep pushing. So I think this information is really worth seeing. It is interesting that when they put out their video, it was after my series comes out. Now, I'm not saying that I would love it if they were watching this channel. Guys, if you're watching this channel, let me know. Give me a shout. I would appreciate it. But I put out this information, I think, well back in July. It's October now, and I started this series for Gen4 versus Gen5 SSDs back in July of 2025. The results that I found, I didn't see coming from a mile away, and I really think if you were looking at a 14th gen Intel system, because people are still building them, you can still buy those CPUs new, and they're still viable systems, still fast systems. I think this data is really comparing the LGA1700 socket with the AM5 socket. And there's pros and cons, and I go over that. Now, if you're really wanting the nuts and bolts in the longer version of the video, go back and watch the three separate videos. What I tried to do here was take all three and try to chop them down, and I put a bunch of other cuts in there so it's not as clean, not as smooth, but the data is all in one spot. And if that would help everybody, I put all the data into one video. I will try to put some timestamps and stuff here in the description to help see what you might want to view, but that'll take a little bit more time. But hey, I'm trying to make sure that this information gets out to you because I really think you're going to want to see what I found in my data. So with that being said, it is a longer video because of the three big videos that I put together. So let's get right to it. Hope you enjoy it and found it as interesting as I did. Enjoy. So if you can use a Gen 5, then you absolutely should. But what system do you have, and can you really take advantage of it? Is it worth your money? So I know I'm probably the majority of my people are men. So I do have some ladies watching the channel. For the ladies, you've probably read your motherboard manual, and you know exactly what your board is capable of and how everything works and how things are split out. But I would venture to guess that the gentlemen here probably haven't read it.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
Now, there's probably a few, hopefully, several of you enthusiasts out there that absolutely know everything about your motherboard. But for those who might need a little bit of help, to not waste money. Like, don't go out and get this if it's not going to help you. Because the only reason I'm saying that is if you've got an Intel system, you know, I build a lot of Intel rigs. There's a downside to the 14th gen Intel systems that AMD, the AM5 platform does not suffer from. Okay, and so you may have a motherboard, like I have a Master X motherboard in my main rig. The X870E motherboard for the AM5 platform also has a Gen 5 SSD slot, but and then also supports Gen 5 X16 lane for your GPU. But there's a downside to Intel here that you need to be aware of, that maybe if you're working through getting this transfer rate speeds, you might be losing performance with your graphics card. And it's all laid out in your motherboard manual. So, and what we're going to do is we're going to go through this right now, the schematics and how to read this diagram to make sure that you're putting devices and plugging things in the most efficient and most productive places. You may end up inadvertently sharing lanes and slowing down speeds when you didn't intend to. And I think the Intel platform, the 14th gen, is much more susceptible to that because it has 20 lanes, and you will then have to share. If you have to share when you plug in a Gen 5 SSD, then it's going to drop your lanes on your X16 graphics card slot down to 8. You thought you were getting 16 and the full speed of Gen 5, but you're going to drop it to Gen 5 X8, which is the same as Gen 4 X16. So it's still fast, but you are losing potentially performance by using devices and having to share bandwidth, if you will. The AMD setup doesn't suffer from that. So that is a plus when you're building an AMD rig, that you do not have to share the bandwidth. There's 20, I believe 24 lanes, and you then don't have to share with your truncating your X16 down to X8. You can leave it at X16, and then you still have the lanes for your SSD. But my question is, like, as if you're in one of my situations where deciding, is it good to go ahead and buy a Gen 5 drive? This hybrid Gen 5 drive is interesting. It's either Gen 4 at X4 or it's Gen 5 at X2. That's a unique situation, but I don't think you can only allocate 2 lanes. I think once it sees Gen 5, I believe, this is my initial assessment, that it still uses 4 lanes, but you're only using 2 of them. So I don't think that helps us in this situation, still lose the same amount of performance. What I'm going to do is do my best to test this and see exactly what my transfer rates end up being with my GPU in place and my Intel rig versus my AMD rigs. And let's just see what kind of real world performance we're going to get. But first, let's go review these schematics and take a look at much more detail of what I'm really talking about. Okay, let's go ahead and take a peek at these 3 motherboards. That ought to give us a good idea of how to go about reading your own manual for whatever board you have. And let's delve right in. Okay, so the first one we'll look at is the Master X, and it does have a PCI Express 5 bus, and it is at X16, but there's a switch, and it will switch from the single PCI Express 16 at X16, or it will switch down to PCI Express 8 if you're going to use M2C underscore CPU, the M2 socket 3. It will take your PCI Express and go X8, X4. Okay, so that means you're going to use this slot for your main GPU. There's your M2C underscore GPU, the one that's right on top of the GPU slot. That's usually the ones that have the largest coolers and trying to keep these 5th gen SSDs cool. So if you plug a device into that, then you will cut your PCI Express lanes in half for your GPU. Now, what I'm going to do is actually test that and see how much that really matters. But there are other sockets on this motherboard, but they're not Gen 5. So is it worth it to me to spend the money
for a Gen 5 SSD and voluntarily lose out on half the lanes, half the speed? I mean, potentially, I don't know how much difference it really makes. I'm going to test it, but is it worth it to spend that money and lose a little bit of GPU performance, but pick up transfer speed performance? I don't know. You have to take that into consideration because those Gen 5 drives are a lot more expensive than the Gen 4 drives. Okay, the next board we'll look at is the X870E Taichi Lite. And this is all off the CPU lanes. And because there are more lanes on the AM5 platform than there are with the LGA1700 platform, you have a PCI Express Gen 5 X16, and it'll go X16 or X8. So if I do plug in an M2 card into the board on this particular motherboard, on the Taichi Lite, it doesn't switch. It's right here, PCIe Gen 5 X4, all by itself, dedicated lanes, will not slow down your PCI Express GPU slots at all. This is a plus for the AM5 platform for sure. So it's worth it if you want to get the fastest transfer rate out of an SSD and not lose any lanes on your GPU card. Now, so those AM5 people, enjoy it. Check your motherboard manual, see if it's the same for you. It should be. And then finally, this is the Intel test bench, the Elite AX motherboard. Okay, so now there's a PCI Express 5 bus, runs at X16. So I'm getting the full speed out of my GPU slot, and then I don't see a switch. But the problem with that, the reason I don't see a switch is because there's not a PCI Express 5 lanes for an SSD. So it doesn't even support plugging in a Gen 5 SSD. You can only put X4, X4, X4. So those 3 sockets, one off the CPU bus, and this is off the motherboard bus down here. And then you've got PCI Express 4 buses down here off the chipset. So again, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 places for SSDs. None of them are Gen 5. The Gen 5 slot is for the GPU, and it won't switch down because it won't have to ever be put in a position to share lanes. So you would never put a Gen 5, and I will say never. Like, can you put a Gen 5 SSD into a Gen 4 slot? Yes, they're backwards compatible. Does that mean that you're going to get better performance? I mean, these are theoretical throughput maxes. So does that mean that your theoretical throughput on a Gen 4 running it at max never really runs at max, and it will actually run that way with a Gen 5? I don't know. It's a great question. Maybe I'll test that too. But as it stands right now, it would not be worth the money to me to buy a Gen 5 SSD for the Intel test bench because it doesn't support it. All right, so let's get right into this SSD information. I was a little shocked, honestly, at what I'm about to present to you. I really didn't see this coming a mile away. I thought that my SSD here was the bottleneck, and that if I would use a faster Gen or a Gen 5 SSD, that maybe my rendering performance would improve and my rendering times would drop. So the goal is to compare Gen 4 and Gen 5 SSDs, looking at the different codecs and containers and how fast it takes to render these things. And I also looked at a bunch of other synthetic benchmarks because if you'll know, I'm on an Intel 14th Gen platform. In order to use a Gen 5 SSD, I have to split and share Gen 5 lanes with my PCI Express bus, meaning I won't get PCI X16 with my Gen 5 GPU. I will have to split down to Gen 5 X8, and then the remaining 8, I'll use 4 lanes or X4 of those for my SSD. Will that affect my performance? So I looked at bus speeds, PCI Express, I looked at SSD benchmarks, and tried to get a good picture of what we have in store. So the systems, and the way I did this is that I saw this coming, right? Said, well, this data is not valid. I mean, there's not a lot of people using the 14th gen platform, and I'd beg to differ. I think that's still a popular platform, and that it's still, these CPUs are still being sold brand new. They're still popular. If you can keep them cool, check out the information. I like the way my systems run, and I like the platform, and it's still really fast. Your XOCs or your 14th gen Intel systems. You want to build a fast system, build an Intel system. If you're going to build a gaming system, build an AMD system. If you want a productivity system, I would lean toward Intel. So that's where we are. And the AMD bench has dedicated PCIe Express lanes for Gen 5 SSDs, and you don't have to share with your off the CPU bus. You don't have to share lanes with your GPU. You do with the office rig. With the Master X motherboard, it'll split it down to X8, X4, and those extra X4 go to the Gen 5 SSD for full speed, and then you're truncating your potential bus speed with your GPU. It is comparing the AMD test bench was a 9900X, Tai Chi Lite, 32 gig of 6000 megahertz transfer memory. I'm using the 5070 Ti. That's what I normally use in my main rig. And so I had another PNY 5070 Ti that I tossed back and forth between the systems using the same card, same SSD sticks. The only thing different was what system I had it in and where I put the SSDs. So this is the GPU comparison. Now this is the 5070 Ti. What I've highlighted here as it relates to the other 50 series cards that I have tested here on this channel. The 9100 Pro is the Gen 5 X4 2 terabyte drive, and your advertised speeds are listed for you here. I don't really want to read to you. That's insulting. But here's what the purchase price was around July 2025. The 990 Pro it's really their top of the line Gen 4 drive. It's 2 terabyte in nature. Yes, both of these have cache on the chips, and your advertised speeds are listed here. So look, you're getting twice the speed if you can leverage that Gen 5 speed. And then the 990 Evo Plus is listed as a hybrid drive. So Gen 4 or Gen 5 hybrid. You Gen 4 X4 or Gen 5 X2. It's really a wash because the speeds equate to being the same. Your advertised speeds are the following. I use PugetBench, Render Times, Davinci Resolve Studio 20, synthetic benchmarks, particularly leaning on 3D Mark, and then looking at the SSD drives themselves. I tried to be consistent in where I put them in what slots on the motherboard. So on the office rig, the 9100 Pro was the Gen 5 drive, and I put it in one of two positions. The Gen 5 location was the PCIe slot M2C underscore CPU, or a Gen 4 location, because my thought is, what if we put a Gen 5 drive in the Gen 4 location to maximize the theoretical transfer rates and yet not lose the performance by splitting the lanes? Is there a benefit to that versus just leaning on a Gen 4 in a Gen 4 slot? So I use the CPU lanes for the Gen 5. The Gen 4 locations of the PCI Express X4 were as follows. I would boot the system. They all were imaged the same, so there was no difference in the files that were on these drives, and I would determine which one I booted from. I would run test, and I would boot from the Gen 5 as the primary, and I would render as it was the primary. Or I would boot from this and then render onto another one as the secondary drive to see if there was a difference if you used a Gen 5 or a Gen 4 in the primary boot and primary capacity, or if it was the scratch disk, something else booted the system and it was a secondary drive that you rendered to. What were your performance differences there even? So another variable. And then as I would check these off, then I would boot from a different one and make that one the primary, and then render to the Gen 5 or render to another Gen 4 and work through it in that fashion. I ran the Gen 5 9100 Pro in its Gen 5 X4 location, which is M2_1, and that is where you will have dedicated lanes. Your GPU has all X16, and you have 4 lanes for your Gen 5 SSD, so you can maximize throughput and performance with this particular setup. And so here is your PCI Express, and here is your Gen 5 lane that you would put your Gen 5 SSD into. And so that's where I ran it. And then if I was going to, I have been using this Gen 4 lane with, previous testing, because I didn't own a Gen 5 SSD. This was my first foray into, okay, I can't wait to see all this performance. So here we go. Let's go right into disk mark 64 to see, am I really going to get these advertised speeds? And the advertised speeds are your sequential reads, basically. Those are going to be your drag race speeds that they're going to advertise on the box. And interesting, right? So your 9100 Pros are at the top of the list. And I organized this by the random writes. Now, why I did that is I believe that represents probably the best real world situation, as if you're writing to the drive, rendering files, working with files, generating productive content. You need to be able to write to that disk as quickly as possible. And I organized the fastest to the slowest based on my random write 4K Q32T1 scores. So if you don't like that ranking, all the data is here. I'm not hiding anything from the group. I just chose to organize it in this fashion. If you just want to see your sequential reads and all of that is right here. But this is the way I've organized this data. So the fastest was a 9100 Pro. And all of this is office rig data. The AMD test bench is highlighted in yellow. So the 9100 Pro with your PCI Express lanes cut down to X8, which is really inconsequential for your SSD, because if you've got it plugged in as a Gen 5, the SSD will run at full speed at Gen 5. It has lanes now dedicated to it. What you're really doing is compromising your GPU speed bus, potentially, right? So the fastest was in a secondary situation. So I booted from a different drive, and the Gen 5 was in the Gen 5 slot, halving the PCI Express lanes, and I got 6984. 6686 was the 9100 Pro in a Gen 4 slot, so that I don't have to split my lanes down to X16. Interesting, right? And then the next one was the 9100 Pro as a secondary in a Gen 4 slot. But you can see that all of these aren't very far off. Then the X8 9100 Pro as the primary boot drive in the Gen 5 slot got me 6400. So you do take a hit if you're going to use it as your boot drive, at least from this data, right? And then you start lining up your 990 Pros. So your 9100 Pros were faster, then your 990 Pros, and then your 990 Evo Pluses down at the bottom of the list. So the 990 Pro, a secondary drive in a Gen 4 slot, and it's a Gen 4 drive. I didn't plug them into a Gen 5 slot. Like, the only thing I swapped back from Gen 5, Gen 4 was actually a Gen 5 drive to see if there's any benefit to putting it in a Gen 4 slot. Well, it was still faster than a Gen 4 and a Gen 4. For whatever good that is. You see the difference, if it's worth it to you. And X16, X8, X16, X8, and the 9100 Pros and the 990 Pros all beat the AMD test bench Gen 5 slot in a Gen 5 SSD in its Gen 5 position. It was at 5,000 points. The 990 Evo Plus didn't perform as well. Right now, 9100 Pro and 990 Pro are not doing too bad. What about my 3D Mark? Storage benchmark and PCI test. When you look at the 9100 Pro, and this is organized from the storage benchmark result. So the fastest SSD storage benchmark was the 9100 Pro with the lanes split down to X8 in a primary boot configuration in a Gen 5 slot. Okay, so now it's taking the top spot. Before, it was the 9100 Pro in a secondary configuration, not being the primary. And so then here's a 9100 Pro with the cut down lanes in the Gen 5 slot in the secondary configuration. So I booted from a Gen 4, left the Gen 5 in here, and it took the second spot. And so it's 5% back. And so you can see how these scores pan their way down, right? So then I put the 9100 Pro in a Gen 4 slot, and that kept the lanes at X16. And did that help my scores? Well, it's still slower than putting a Gen 5 drive in a Gen 5 slot. No surprise there. But these were all faster than the AMD bench. But at least all the 9100 Pros were together this time, and the 990 Pro didn't beat it. AMD test bench was 25% slower. Even if I split my lanes, it was slower. Okay, well, let's keep going. PugetBench and Davinci Resolve Studio. PugetBench is an excellent benchmark I've come to really like and appreciate, because it looks at different loads and different types of rendering demands and coding demands that will be put on your system when you're working with Fusion or color correction, and not just rendering the end result, but how effective would your system be at really looking at the gambit of things that Davinci Resolve can put your system under load, and how would it primarily turn out? Well, the basic is the free, and the standard and extended are if you are a studio owner. Then the extended we won't focus on today, but that's if you pay for their benchmark and you get extra tools and things to test with. But right now, let's focus on the standard, because that's what you would get if you were a studio user. And surprisingly, in the top spot is the Gen 4 X16 990 Evo Plus in the primary configuration, 13,240. That surprised me, but not far behind is the 990 Pro in the primary boot drive location, Gen 4. And then third place, only minus 1.3 back, is the 9100 Pro in a Gen 4 slot as the boot drive. That's like, where's the Gen 5? Like, it's down the list here when you got to split the lane, the 9100 Pro in a Gen 5 slot as the primary drive. Of course, all of these are primary because you can't really test on a secondary drive. It always has to be the primary drive. That's why there's nothing secondary here listed. But it's 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth place down of using the Gen 5 and the Gen 5 slot as the primary thing. But it's only 1.7% down. But my question is, why is that slower at all? It should be the top spot. And you've got all these other Gen 4 drives ahead of it. So doesn't seem like you're really able to leverage the speeds that in theory you should be able to get from this drive. And concerning danger, AMD Test Bench took last place. 12% down. It wasn't even a little bit down. It's 12% down. Okay, let it sink in. I'm going to keep moving on. So GPU synthetic benchmarks. Okay, so I've got a situation where I have to split my lanes and potentially lose bus speed, and because of that, I might lose performance with GPU heavy tasks that rely on that bus. And so let's look at Speedway, PortRoyal, TimeSpy, SteelNomad, and I put the scores there, the raw scores that right for you to look at. And then I averaged them and then laid them out in terms of the percent change difference. The top spot was the 9100 Pro in a Gen 4 spot. And again, they have to be primary. You can't test on a secondary drive these benchmarks. It's what you boot from. That's what you get. Looking at the primary drive locations only, the 9100 Pro in a Gen 4 slot, so you're not splitting your lanes, and that took the highest numbers. Then if you take the 9100 Pro and you split your lanes and you put it in the Gen 5 slot, you're only down 0.1% from 14,925 to 14,917. That doesn't seem like a huge hit. That's not what I was really expecting. I was expecting a much bigger drop in performance since I'm splitting my PCI Express lanes in half. So then come the 990 Pro, and then an Evo Plus, and an Evo Plus, and another 990 Pro. So they're all right there by 0.1 to 0.2%. Basically, I would say, is that close enough to run variants and there's no difference? We just said that we split our PCI Express lanes in half and there's no difference? Wow, I was expecting a much bigger drop there. Okay, 12% back, AMD test bench. It's just the numbers. I'm just showing you the numbers. Okay, so does the PCI bus make a difference? If you look at the X8 versus the X16, it basically doesn't make a difference. And this does not include any AMD bench data. This is only the office rig data. Ultimately, I'm doing all these tests to make sure the office rig is the best I could possibly make it. So I didn't really want to continue to test with the office rig, but honestly, there's no other motherboard that I had, the Z790s, that would have a Gen 5 slot. I guess I don't have high-tech enough Intel 14th gen boards that were giving me Gen 5 SSDs. They didn't have to worry about switches and cutting the lanes in half. There was just no Gen 5 SSDs to have to worry about. They're only Gen 4. Now, either that tells me that they've already done this and they realized it doesn't really matter, or they just sort of skimped on the hardware and the chips and the switches and everything, and it's only in your higher end boards like your Master X and up, which that's the way I took it. But looking at the data, it's almost like I dare to say, do you even spend your money on a Gen 5? Like, look at your performance difference. You've got 0.1% slower than Gen 5. The Gen 4 is 0.1% slower. Okay, all right, let's take a minute and think, well, maybe where you really get your performance is your rendering speeds. And you've seen me multiple times look at multiple GPUs and comparing my rendering times. Well, now we're looking at one GPU and looking at where the data is being written to, and if that matters. Okay, so if you're looking at the small, they're going back. I'm not spending a lot of time talking about the files I'm using. There's multiple videos talking about how I set this up. Please refer to them if there's a question about my files here. But it's the same two files multiple times in different codecs and containers. So it's the MOV container H.264 codec, small 4K file. It's like 22 minutes. And that render time is anywhere from 326 to 332. 3 minutes and 26 seconds. And I've organized it in terms of there's my render times, and here's my average write rate. Now, I've got max write and max read. Those were easy to write from hardware info, but when you reset and you start your render, it's a running average. You've got to catch it right when at the end of the read, because I don't want the average to start dropping like a rock when it's done rendering, right? So you have to read these right away, these average reads and these average writes. And I wasn't going to report, I have a lot of other data that I collected. And I wasn't going to report the SSD temperature because I've got a unique setup in the office rig. I have a custom water-cooled solution for the SSDs. The Gen 4 SSDs. The Gen 5 I did not mess with. I wasn't anticipating using it because I didn't want to cut down my lanes, and I thought, well, that's performance I can stand to lose. That's what I initially thought. And so I didn't water cool that. I wasn't using that slot. I wasn't planning on it. It's just got the standard huge chunk cooler on it. And That's it. And I left it alone. Well, when I put the Gen 5 drive in it, obviously I have to start using it. And so it was in a open air chassis. So when I look at my test benches and the AMD test bench, it's an open air bench. And it has the airflow around it that it has the airflow. In my office rig, I took the door off because I wanted to use the same GPU with the same setup and plug it into the board, and it's sitting outside. It's in that caddy, basically. And so I turned my office rig into an open air test bench in the similar fashion. So that slot is not water cooled, and it wasn't more air cooled than my open air test benches. It was basically trying to control that variable as well. And you can see, now the Gen 4 drives are water cooled. Now, if it's a Gen 5 slot, it's not water cooled. It's the air cooled spot. And look at the temperature difference of the Tai Chi light board. It gets hot. And of course, it doesn't in the Master X board. This is the same SSD, same firmware on the SSD. I didn't change any of that. It's the same device, taken out of one and plugged into the other. Now, look at your render times, 3 minutes, 26 seconds. The fastest render times were 9100 Pro in a Gen 4 slot. Your average write rate, 43.8. 44, 44, 43, 43. Where are your speeds? Where are your write speeds? Where are those daunting read speeds? You don't get to use them. That's literally upsetting. You don't even get your Gen 4 numbers out of it, let alone the numbers you're touting for Gen 5 speeds. You don't see it. You don't get it. In a secondary position, there's no max, there's reads. I mean, you're reading off of the primary drive, not the secondary, but you're writing to the secondary. So then your max write is this. So your H.264 movie times, 3 minutes. The AMD bench right there in the middle. Let's do the small 4K file in the AVI Cineform codec and container. 2 minutes, 21 seconds. I alluded to the last video that it is faster to render, but the file size is much larger. But you get to see an uptick in your average write rate. Your read rate is faster, and your average write rate is also faster. Look at the temps though, 73 degrees that sucker hit in that AMD bench. I don't understand. That cooler is not as effective. That's concerning. That's not as well done as the Master X, keeping things quite in check here. 40 degrees. 37 degrees, 73 degrees. A little better in your read rates, but you're just not seeing the same performance. Now, how about the large 4K file in MOV H.264? AMD test bench, bottom of the list, 26 minutes and 44 seconds, as compared to the 9100 Pro in the Gen 4 slot, 2607. The 990 Pro in the Gen 4 slot, 2607. Both in secondary positions. Primary location, 1 second slower. So, okay, kind of a wash. But it's the 9100 Pro in a Gen 4 slot. It's not even the 9100 Pro in the Gen 5 slot. That was 26 minutes and 12 seconds. What? You are missing out, apparently. It's not about your write speeds, because you're not really seeing them. But you do have a truncation of your lanes, but you had a truncation of your lanes up here, and it was about the same. 1 second off, okay? That's probably a run variance wash. Consistently, your 990 Pros and your 9100 Pros, maybe because of the cache it's on the device, come in faster than your Evo Plus. On average, I would say that's why your Evo Pluses are down the list, but I mean, they're not really that far down the list. I'm a little shocked that you just don't see your read and write speeds that they put on the box. And how about the AVI Cineform large 4K file? I only had a 1 terabyte. I should have bought a 2 terabyte drive, because remember, it's 785 gigabyte to generate the final file size of this. So, and with the OS and everything, I needed to have a primary option, and I should have purchased a 990 Evo Plus 2 terabyte instead of a 1 terabyte, and then I'd have been able to run this without issue. But unfortunately, couldn't do it here. but I'm comfortable saying that I'm probably leaning toward a 990 Pro or a 9100 Pro in terms of all the other data that we've seen so far. Not that the Evo Plus is a bad drive, and not that it's not right there neck and neck with it, because it really is a good drive. And but I think for the most part, the 9100 Pro and the 990 Pro are just a hair faster. AMD Test Bench, last place again, and this time by a considerable amount. 19 minutes versus 24 minutes 10 seconds. Your average write rate is here, and I would guess that maybe we throttled or something. We're getting up. These were the max temps. I don't think it throttles at 80. I think it throttles closer to 90, but maybe we had a drop in performance because it was unable to stay cool. You can definitely see a render time difference, but look at the 9100 Pro in the primary and secondary spot. When you truncate your lanes down to X8 and you're trying to use Gen 5 speeds, like, it's at the bottom of the list compared to the other 9100 Pro spots and 990 Pros. Like this, and it's not a huge difference, but again, from 1903 and 1907 to 1930, I mean, that's enough to be have a difference, I think. Your best when you're really trying to rip through data is to rip through onto a secondary drive. There might be a benefit to putting a Gen 5 drive or a high quality Gen 4 drive into a Gen 4 slot to maximize your throughput and your data transfer. So that's why I think your 990 Pro is right up there in the secondary slot in the Gen 4. Slight difference there, because I think the 9100 Pro is much more capable, but is it really worth spending money on a Gen 5 and then putting it in a Gen 4 slot? I mean, you put it in a Gen 5 slot and you didn't really see the data throughput. That's concerning. You do have much faster max writes compared to the others. I guess, I don't know, is that enough to say that that's significant? You be the judge. But I'm looking at my render times, my actual productivity of getting work done, and it's down the list. And I didn't really see this coming. So what do you choose? I'm shocked that the Gen 5 did not improve my performance to any appreciable difference. And is it really worth spending the extra money to put it in a Gen 4 slot, use it as a scratch drive? I just think that's kind of a waste. Disappointed in buying a Gen 5 drive right now. This was very eye-opening to me. And then maybe the 5070 Ti, maybe if I had a 5090 and I plugged it in, maybe that would accentuate the drop in performance if I had to split the lanes. I am now interested in saying that, was the 5070 Ti not fast enough to create a bottleneck? And shocking results the first time I went through this. Like, I was really expecting more out of the Gen 5 NVMe drive, and I didn't see the write performance that is touted on the front of the box, right? And there's reasons for that, but at the same time, I need a little better explanation. Let's see if we can't come up with something else here today. And let's not use the 5070 Ti. Use the same setup and just limit. I'm going to even further limit the SSDs that I tested with. But now I want to compare the 5090 data to what I collected with the 5070 Ti. So this is your GPU comparison. There's your 5090 data, the stats versus your 5070 Ti stats. You can see that it truly is a step up. And if you've been looking at my previous MSI Gaming Trio 5090 comparison data with how it really compares with rendering and the general performance, there's a huge chasm of difference between the 5080 and the 5090. And it's much tighter between the 5070 Ti and the 5080. And quite frankly, it's not worth buying the 5080. In my opinion, the 5070 Ti checks all the boxes that you would want for productivity, for gameplay, for across the board, just having a GPU, if you're not going to swing for the fences and get the 5090. If you can swing for this guy and get a 5090, and you're obviously going to be happy with it if you can spend this kind of money. Now, prices are starting to come down. That's in our favor. We need a little bit more competition from AMD. Things are coming about. That's not what this is about today. Let's jump right into this information. So I went streamlined the Samsung SSDs even more, and just with the 9100 Pro, which is the Gen 5 drive, and the 990 Pro, which is the Gen 4 drive, both have onboard cache, but you can see the advertised read and write speeds. Okay, so maybe some of this will look familiar to you. If you've not seen the last video, please go back and check out that SSD video so that you can see how this was set up, and I'm trying not to repeat myself and make these videos very long, but we need to get on the same page here. Okay, so what's in orange is the 5090 data that I added to the existing data that was already presented. Okay, and I added another column of the GPU. Before, it was all the same GPU. I didn't need to differentiate, but now what's in orange is 5090 data. Okay, so the crystal disk mark, and again, I didn't organize it as you would expect from the sequential reads and writes. Those are those large numbers that are tattooed on the front of your box to get you to spend the money to buy the drive, right? I looked at it from the random write data. I mean, because we're going to be creating content, video editing, writing larger files to the disk. So that, to me, I think is the more relevant benchmark, is to sort it by the random write speed. Okay, and you can see that there's not a huge difference here, but interestingly, the 9100 Pros were all at the top of the list, but it was a trade-off between the 5070 Ti and the 5090. Well, that's really not that big a deal because the GPU is not coming into play here, right? It's, does the drive have the level of performance that you need? Interestingly, though, the 9100 Pro is all the same stick. I only own one. That's it. So any variance you see here, and I wasn't changing around the location of the drive. If it said it was in a Gen 5 slot, there's only one slot it could be in this Master X motherboard. And there's only one drive that was used. Only one system it was used in for this testing, and whether it was primary means you booted from the drive. Secondary means a different drive booted the device and it was in a Gen 5 slot, or it was in a Gen 4 slot. I actually tried to test whether or not you could just maximize the benefits by putting a Gen 5 in a Gen 4 slot. Obviously, you're not going to get Gen 5 speeds, but can you maximize Gen 4 performance with a Gen 5 SSD? And it's really a waste of money, as you would imagine. But anyway, it was tested, right? All right, so you've got reasonable performance down the list. So we're getting the benefits, right? There's what's on the front of the box. Your sequential read rates, 14,000. The 9100 Pro, it's in a Gen 4 slot. So it's 7,000 read rate. You put it back in a Gen 5 slot and you get 14,000. You put it back in a Gen, and this is inconsequential to whether or not you've split the PCIe lanes, because if you're putting the drive into a Gen 5 slot, it ends up getting dedicated Gen 5 X4 lanes, and you rob from the PCI Express for your GPU bus. So you should see all of the performance out of your SSD because you now have dedicated lanes you've robbed from your GPU lanes. Okay, that's basically how all this is set up, and you're getting the touted benchmarks out of these drives. But can you put this speed to use when you're actually trying to be productive? So let's jump right to 3D Mark, the storage benchmark, and PCI Express test. I organized it by the storage benchmark score. So the GPU, 9100 Pro, the 5070 Ti, the Gen 5 slot, and it was booted with the Gen 5 card. That was the top performance for the benchmark. Then the 5090 data in the primary spot, got the second spot only 2% back. All right, and you can see the PCI Express lanes, they're cut down. The BIOS took it to X8, and it's cut in half from what you would get if it was left in an X16 mode with the drive plugged into Gen 4, so the Gen 5 slot is not used, and so you're not cutting those lanes in half, and you get 43. And again, if it's an X16, if it's a 990 Pro in a Gen 4 spot, here's your scores, right? And so PCI lanes are cut down. You're not getting stellar scores in a Gen 5 location, even though they are faster. They are at the top of the slot, but they're not twice the speed of when they're in a Gen 4 slot, which is unfortunate, right? So I'm not seeing blazing speeds while we're sacrificing the PCI lanes. So Puget Benchmark 1.2.0 and Davinci Resolve Studio 20. This is where I'm using the Davinci Resolve Studio, using these two with the Puget Benchmark to see what kind of scores that we're going to get. What was our best score? Our best score was obviously the 5090s at the top of the list. They can process through the data much faster than a 5070 Ti. There's no shocker there, okay? So obviously, we're best to keep a 5090 in the machine. Now, what about the Gen 5 versus Gen 4 drive? And the top spot was the Gen 5 drive with the lanes cut in half with a 5090 booting the system, giving us a standard score of 15,790. If we use the 990 Pro and did not have the Gen 5 drive in the system and did not split our lanes, that was at X16, and it didn't lose by much, by 0.3%. Then if we put the 9100 Pro in the device and split the lanes, but booted from a 990 Pro in the Gen 4 lane, so the Gen 5 card was secondary, but you're running on your primary card, again, you didn't see much of a difference. It's kind of a wash. Really, if you're being academic about it, splitting your lanes and using the Gen 5 drive is the fastest way to go when you're going to use PugetBench and Davinci Resolve, looking at all the different scenarios that PugetBench can put Davinci Resolve under, okay? Running a full gambit of tests. And the standard score is your studio if you're a paid user. Basic is if you're running the free version. You're more optimized to get the studio version. All right, so why don't we just leave it in the system with the lanes cut down? Well, do we lose our GPU speeds? Okay, let's look at that. Fastest scores, and we're doing average. This is Speedway, PortRoyal, TimeSpy, SteelNomad. And then the average score, sorted by the average score. Look at the huge difference in scores. And again, that's 5090 for you. So the fastest average 5090 score was using the Gen 5 drive with lanes cut in half, and you got the top scores. Had the Gen 5 drive in place and then booted from the Gen 4 drive and then ran the tests with the Gen 4 drive in place, but the Gen 5 drive was there splitting our lanes in half, it only was down by less than 0.5%. Not what I thought would happen, right? And then in third place was the Gen 5 drive is not in the system. This is like the baseline run. No Gen 5 in the system. The 990 Pro Gen 4 drive as the primary boot drive, running the tests on the Gen 4 drive, and not splitting your lanes from X16 to X8. And that was in third place by almost down 1%, 0.7%, right? They are so close. 25,700 to 25,900. And you got the best scores with the Gen 5 drive as the boot drive and splitting your GPU lanes in half. I don't understand why that is. Like, it's not supposed to be that close, right? Otherwise, are we not utilizing our PCI lane sufficiently, or this Master X motherboard and this gigabyte stuff when you're splitting lanes really is not splitting lanes. You're doing better. Like, how is this possible? Well, maybe there's a difference when you render. So let's look at the 4 different situations when you render in Davinci Resolve. And we're doing Davinci Resolve Studio, and it's the same 2 4K files. There's a small 4K file that's 21 minutes and change, and a large 4K file that's over 90 minutes long. And these are 2 videos that are on my channel right now. And all I did was put them in the system and render them. Render to whatever the configuration is here on the screen, right? For example, the fastest render time, and that's what I sorted by, was render time. And when you look at the chart, it's no surprise that the 5090 is the top of the list, right? It's going to render the files faster than a 5070 Ti. More grunt there, right? But what shocks me is the 5090 is at the top of the list. The 9100 Pro is also at the top of the list, even though we're splitting our lanes in half, but from X16 to X8. And whether you've booted from the drive in the primary or you've booted from a Gen 4 and then render to the secondary drive, which is the Gen 5 drive. The Gen 5 drive was in the Gen 5 slot. Render times are the same. Max read rate is only 120 meg per second. Averaged only 33. Max write was 113 megabytes per second. The average was 48. Temps, cool. No problem. But if you look at utilization, I didn't put this information there. I collected a lot more. I mean, you didn't like have a total of 100% activity going on. So the drive isn't the bottleneck. The Gen 4 drive or the Gen 5 drive. Where are these speeds? I'm not even getting Gen 4 speeds anywhere down the list. I mean, obviously the GPU isn't the bottleneck here. What's the bottleneck? Is it just the software and just the need for the time to render everything? I mean, something has to work better. I mean, obviously 5090 has more grunt, so it's doing it in 3 minutes and 2 to 5 seconds versus almost 3.5 minutes, right? So that's a nice uplift in performance for rendering, but I don't see the benefit really in having the Gen 5 drive with my reads and write speeds. They're about the same whether you're using a Gen 4 or a Gen 5 drive. Concerning, very concerning. Like, where's my performance here? AVI Cineform, small file, top of the list, 2 minutes, 12 seconds. 9100 Pro with lane split. 5090 obviously at the top of the list, running the chart down, right? Office rig, primary location in the Gen 5 slot was the fastest by a second. With a max read of 146, average 13, max write 2300, average 643, temps are cool as a cucumber. Where's my performance difference between the Gen 5 and the Gen 4 drive? Render time's no difference. And I found the same thing with the 5070 Ti, and I thought, well, maybe that's the problem. Maybe if I had more GPU grunt, that my average reads and writes would go up. But look down the list, that's not it either. So I'm not really getting the benefit of the Gen 4, let alone the Gen 5. Even though the Gen 5, when it can go faster, it does read and write faster than a Gen 4 if given the opportunity, which is, I think, why it's in at the top of the list. One of the things I did look at was, well, does it, by offloading that read, does it change the read at all? And really it just shifts it to the other drive. The rates and the demands are the same. It just offloads it, and it doesn't always equate to the secondary drive rendering being faster than if it was the primary location. As you can see, the primary was faster here. If offloading the reading to the other primary drive while you secondarily wrote to the, calling it a scratch drive, and uses a secondary scratch drive and rendered to that drive and only had the write rates and write devices And that should, in theory, be faster, but it's not always the case. What about using the larger 4K file with AVI Cineform? I mean, this is like 700 and almost 800 gigabyte file when you render this. And you can see that your write rate does pick up. Shows that the codec that you're using really matters in terms of how fast you can write to something, because the hardware has to do a lot more encoding when you're using H.264, H.265, and inter versus interframe, and you're versus AVI Cineform, where you're doing slice, every frame matters, and you're recording every frame, so you just put the foot on the accelerator and just code, right? And so there's much less encoding that needs to happen and much more writing of frames, which is why your write rates and your average write rates are much higher with the AVI Cineform, but also your file sizes are through the roof, right? So as you look down the list, you see 5090s are still at the top of the list, and not always the 9100 Pro. Like you're right there in the ballpark, 1750, 1754. But again, the secondary 990 Pro is probably your best option, but right there, second and third place, is your Gen 5 drive. And there is a faster write rate with the Gen 5 drive. So it's trying. Is that run variance? Is that really Gen 5 performance that we're seeing? It's not the same amount that's listed on the box, right? It's close, I guess. I don't know. But it's not to the level that I thought I was going to get. What do we do with all this now? My previous conclusion was it didn't really matter. Don't waste the money on a Gen 5 drive. And then I didn't want to give up on it. I thought, okay, well, maybe the GPU is the bottleneck. Maybe there's something to be said here if we put better hardware in the system. It's weird to say that the 5070 Ti is not enough. That's hard for me to fathom, but maybe, all right, throw a 5090 in, let's check it out. The Gen 5 SSD still had minimal benefit, even with a 5090. There was some benefit in a Gen 4 slot, and there was some benefit to keeping it in the Gen 5 slot, even though you were splitting the lanes, because I was also shocked that you didn't see the performance hit, even when you've got the grunt of a 5090 trying to overload the bandwidth of the PCI lane and really jam data through there. I thought I was really going to see the drop in performance because we had to share the lane from X16 down to X8. And I really didn't see that. And I can't explain that. I thought this would be the ultimate test to show you that we really shouldn't be splitting the lanes. And I can't make that claim because even when we looked at the Speedway and the SteelNomad, I was still getting about the same average scores, even if we split the lanes in half. Now, which makes me wonder, now, was there something wrong with my setup? Like, the only other thing I can come up with is that I was using riser cables, but they were supposedly, and they're written on their Gen 5 riser cables. We did see when we ran the PCI Express test that the lanes were cut in half. So that was a legit test. But if it's not the riser cable, then I don't know how to explain why we didn't see more of a drop in performance. Because obviously I've tested two cards, same system, in different configurations of X16 versus X8 in Gen 5, and I didn't get it really a difference. So if anybody else understands why it was about the same for me, that either there's something wrong with the way I did it, or it's really not that big a deal. I mean, if it's not that big a deal, I should leave the Gen 5 drive right there in the Gen 5 slot, cut my lanes in half, and forget that it's even in there, because it frankly doesn't seem to matter. But I'm not trying to do that if maybe my riser cable was limiting me, even though it's supposed to be a PCI Gen 5 cable, and I should have huge performance differences compared to what I'm getting. I not really think that's the case, but I'm open to discussion. Sound off in the comment section. Help me understand if I went wrong, where did I go wrong? But I don't know how else to explain it. Let me know what you think of this particular test and these SSDs, because it's not making a lot of sense. Why would you spend the money on a Gen 5 when that's the only performance that you end up seeing? All right. Anyway, thanks for staying tuned. Stay safe. God bless.